Hi, my name is Trevor Williams. I'm here with Dr. Leslie Marsh from Georgia State University, and we're here for the latest edition of the Authors Amplified series of interviews and podcasts. So I wanted to give a little bit of background. I'm with Global Atlanta. We're an international business news service here in Atlanta, covering how Atlanta connects with the rest of the world. And we're doing this series in partnership with the Atlanta Global Studies Center, which is one of our partners for the year. We've done this series for approximately 2.5 years now in various forms. Started as a virtual endeavor during the pandemic, and we've carried it over to in-person events, and now I've kind of moved it to this podcast format. So we're excited about welcoming Dr. Marsh here. I'm going to give her a quick introduction, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Dr. Marsh, welcome to Constellations.
Hi, nice to be here. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for coming. So Dr. Marsh specializes in Hispanic and Lusophone film and media studies. And she's focused on visual practices that pose challenges to the boundaries of belonging and intervene in the creation of new political imaginations. And we'll get into what all that means in just a moment. But she's had previous books prior to the ones that we're going to talk about today. The one that we're going to talk about today, previous book, Brazilian Women's Filmmaking from Dictatorship to Democracy, was published in 2012. And examines the diverse practices of female filmmakers in Brazil from the military dictatorship to the present, or the present at that point. And then she worked on 2 different edited projects we just talked about a little bit. One was called Building the Bricks, focused on this kind of block, this emerging market block of countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, now South Africa. And just how they navigate power in the new world. And then she's also focused on the emerging middle class and emerging markets. So very excited to talk to you today. And I wanted to get you, if you wouldn't mind, just to tell us a little bit about your personal journey. Well, first of all, let's introduce the book. Sorry. So Branding Brazil is the book. Transforming Citizenship on Screen is the book we'll be talking about today. And this was published in 2021.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But based on a period that we'll talk about that was much earlier than the time that it was published. So we do want to clarify that, and we will. But very excited to talk about Branding Brazil, and I really love the design of this. As someone who was a favela tourist at one point a long time ago, this is really great to see. Anyway.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah, for sure. We can certainly talk about that. And the thing about Brazil that's so amazing and interesting is that it's just so multifaceted, like any society is, but Brazil seems to always have something new and interesting to talk about. But we'll get into that. So tell us a bit about how you started focusing on Brazil yourself personally. Were you a student? Did you happen on this by chance?
Well, I had in undergrad, I was at the University of Illinois, and Portuguese was an option of a language to study, but I was studying Spanish. And I thought, well, one day, it seems so, love the sounds of it. Yeah. I just thought, okay, sometime in the future. I actually ended up living and working and studying in Barcelona, Spain, and I kept running into Brazilians and a lot of Brazilian representation on the soccer team, Barca. And so there was a curiosity that seed was planted. When I got to grad school, it was really a professor of mine who had heard me make some references and express some curiosity about Brazil and Portuguese, who encouraged me to seek some funding and to explore that interest more. Especially, I was interested in film and media studies. So shout out to professors who who encourage their students. But I also was able to get a small amount of funding to go to Brazil and do a feasibility study to see if I could make the connections at the archives and to connect with people. And I'm very grateful for the funds that were donated to allow students like myself to go and take advantage of that opportunity. And it was the point of departure to the work I've been able to do. So
and now full circle. I'm not even sure if I said this in the intro, but you're department chair of World Languages and Cultures now in Georgia State's College of Arts and Sciences. So really enabling that experience, I think, for other students now. And I have a similar origin story to you with China, not quite as academic, but had started going there in college and started studying the language, and then got pulled into that as well. So these countries have a way of being vortexes that will pull you in
Pull
indefinitely.
you in, yeah.
But yeah, so tell us about branding Brazil. I mean, this examines the period of the early 2000s and 2010s. It was a very transformative period in Brazil's modern history. This was a time where there was a lot of optimism, a lot of economic growth,
Right.
and then big mega events on the horizon. So tell us about why you chose this period and how you kind of define branding for the purposes of the book.
Yeah, that's well, I think the period in question is, as you said, it's a real vibrant moment in time. Starting in the book more officially looks at the period from 2003 to about 2014, with a little bit more coda to 2018. And this period of time, I think, was marked by 5 important factors. One, and the international point would be in 2001 and 2002. I was living in Brazil doing dissertation research there, and the September 11th attacks took place. And then 2 months later, Jim O'Neill published the position paper working for Goldman Sachs, declaring or identifying Brazil as a BRIC, an emerging nation, part of the BRIC. So Brazil was being identified as this new emerging nation with great promise in the political and economic arena. So those are 2 international events, and it seemed like there was the potential for significant change. I was also in Brazil. Second point would be the election campaigns in 2002. On the ground, it felt like something was shifting. People were interested in demanding change, and they did. People elected Lula, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, for his first administration. And that was the first time a democratically elected president, there was a transition from one democratically elected president to another. Then there were other factors. If you think about the time period that marked this moment, the global financial crisis of 07-08, Brazil was affected by the financial crisis, but it bounced back relatively quickly. And at that time, Brazil was identified as the country to host the World Cup Games and the Olympic Games. Brazil it shifted. China became Brazil's primary trade partner in 2009. Then you get the celebration of the middle class around 2010, 2011. There were books. People were like, hey, the economic development started to have an impact on people's lives. There was a real feeling that Brazil was overcoming its long-standing income inequality and changing, and partly because of some policies that Lula had put into place, but also just there was a cultural shift, there was a political shift. And then I would say a fifth point would be the belief when people, the development of the middle class or the classe C, the C class, and those designations, as you may know, come from advertising. There were new lifestyle practices. People had more money in their pockets. They were encouraged to spend their money to become consumers. But they also had a greater visibility. People started to have greater visibility in society that they hadn't had in the past. Started to occupy spaces they hadn't in the past as well. So,
do you think that's related to digital exposure through social media, et cetera? Because that would have come later in the period. Or was that more just within Brazilian society? I
would say just in general, just physically, the people who had been previously excluded from airports, shopping malls, other spaces were now able and encouraged to occupy those spaces. So in terms of your other question about branding, how I understand it, I wanted to explore how development, economic development and political development had an impact on narratives about the nation, about cultural identity, how people understood that. And I looked at these stories in film and media production, film, television, social media, photography, because the stories we tell ourselves and are told to us shape how we live, act, how we think. And I wanted to specifically think about how these narratives seem to have some kind of profit motive behind them.
Yeah.
And that's when I turned to branding as a way to frame, to develop a critical framework to think about the films and television shows. What is it that how they were talking about?
What was behind it?
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Yeah, I want to get into that because I think particularly the late 90s period was interesting in the book, like how you talked about the reframing of the dictatorship.
Right, yeah.
So maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But I think in general, you get this question of does art imitate life or does life imitate art? And I think the branding question kind of could be posed that way. But before we get to that, why do you think, why can you give us a bit of background as to why the election of Lula was so important in 2002,
Right.
Given Brazil's recent modern history and
Right,
and why that represented such a watershed moment?
I'm sure there are a number of ways to respond to that question, but I think from my perspective, he had been kind of an outsider. He'd been a union activist. Was not part of a elite family growing up. He had run for election in the past as a representative of the PT party and had not been successful. And this time he broke through. And so that it seemed like a moment when your average person could become the leader of the nation. And that's when was the last time an average person
Yeah, exactly.
was elected to be the leader of a country as large as Brazil?
Yeah. And it also came after this period of dictatorship from the 60s to the 80s and then some really rough financial times for Brazil through the 90s, right? Because you had depreciation of the currency and some of the things that other Latin American countries are still going through.
Right, yeah.
But was that also part of it, like the economic aspect and the fact that you had this transition between parties that hadn't happened before?
I think why it was such a pivotal moment, that's part of it. I think that some of the economic policies that Fernando Henrique Cardoso had put into place from 95 to 2002, the Real Plan, the controlling inflation, I think that it started to have an effect.
Yeah.
It was the timing. I think there are many ways to answer that question, but I think it was really the timing, the moment, his background, the fact that he was a regular citizen who was involved in
so it
politics.
kind of mirrored the hopes of the people, maybe in a way.
Yeah. But it wasn't. No one's ever elected without someone not wanting. It wasn't seamless. So I don't want to suggest that there was.
Well, and he gets credit for the Bolsa Familia and like all of the welfare programs that kind of lifted a lot of people out of poverty and kind of helped. Brazil really had the biggest poverty reduction of any country, maybe except for China, and during this period that was examined in the book, really. But going back to the question of branding. You talk about how film and branding is used as a way to generate economic development or try to attract foreign investment. Right. Can you talk a bit about that and what were the driving forces there? Were they mainly profit motives of commercial enterprises, or do you have the government pushing this, like with Gilberto Gil being the culture minister, et cetera?
Right.
Or is it kind of an interplay of all of the above?
Well, I think there are a couple of layers to the branding. I think there's one way of looking at branding is to think about specific campaigns. So, for example, place branding. And I do talk about that, how you find campaigns in Rio that wanted to develop their film industry. And so they promoted Rio as a site for international film production. And as we've seen in Georgia, the film industry has attracted a significant, it's a huge business now. But there's also a more general kind of holistic way of thinking about branding and looking at some of the discursive practices or the ways of communicating, the types of narratives that are told. And I was interested in looking at that the idea of promising progress, for example, is something you find in branding. Product A is going to be the new and improved. You'll be younger, faster, taller, better.
Yeah, exactly.
There's also this discursive practice in branding, cultivating buy-in, convincing someone to try something that it'll work out, or showing someone how to use a product or a service. And then a third practice of branding that I thought was interesting was resolving tensions. In this particular moment, you see, A versus B, product A versus product B. You see these tensions because you see these shifts. It seemed like these significant shifts in north-south and south-south-south geopolitical relations. I wanted to look at that kind of tension that you find. So there are, again, specific campaigns, but then also just in a broader sense, thinking about branding in a broader way.
Yeah. So how would you say Brazil at that time was kind of dealing with its past, like in this heady moment of future-facing, optimism? Anybody can do anything. Economy's growing largely because China's buying all the soybeans.
Right.
But you talked about this Globo dictatorship film cycle, this kind of like reframing of that narrative, which I thought would be kind of interesting to explore, because that's a specific instance in the book that you really lay out.
Right.
And I thought that was so interesting because I hadn't really thought about the way that film shapes the stories we tell ourselves, or TV, but obviously it does.
An understanding of the past.
Yeah.
Well, in 2004, you had the anniversary of the dictatorship from 1964 to 85. And then the transition period, the new constitution was ratified in 1988. And then you had films that emerged in the late 90s and in the early 2000s that were reflecting on that time period. Now that Brazil had a period of time where it was a democracy, it had established, it had a new currency. Looking back, you had films that reflected on the dictatorship period. But at this particular moment in time, it was a different Brazil.
Right.
You have a PT president, former president, you have emerging market. So those films created more the past was presented as being more distant.
Yeah. Is it that all those changes give the space for the storytellers, or do you think that the government itself is giving at least tacit, if not direct, approval to these stories being told because it helps their narrative? Or is it a mix?
I would have to go back and see who funded what.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think that it was a heavy-handed propaganda campaign.
Right.
So, I don't think there wasn't an oversight of scripts, but not the Getúlio Vargas period where you do see that. It was a feeling of the way these films talk about the dictatorship, that period, is that it had passed. It was over. It was done. You see certain aspects of the films like fade to white instead of it's just in the closing of films to show that this is done. It erases the past. It's a white page. Now we're a very different nation. This is done. However, was the authoritarianism, the internal strife was over. We are now a new nation. No, that wasn't true. So you have in 2012, you have the Truth Commission Brazil had not had a Truth Commission.
Yeah.
Which then...
Because at that point, it's not even a generation, right, since the dictatorship ended. Yeah.
No.
Can you talk a little bit about how the U.S. and Brazil sort of, or how film portrayals in the U.S. kind of reflected this new reality in Brazil? Or was that an exercise by film studios to capture the market in Brazil? And particularly, you talk about Rio and the Incredible Hulk. I thought those were fascinating.
Award-winning films.
Yeah.
Well, there's a long history of Hollywood representing Brazil in film. I don't know how far back in history you want to go, but you have the Good Neighbor policy era, 1933 to 45. Many films took place in Latin America or had Latin American talent. And that was driven by a need to cultivate relationships with Brazil and Latin America while European markets were shut because of World War II.
Wow.
So, for example, you have Carmen Miranda, who appears in a number of Hollywood films. She was like the highest paid actress, I think, in Hollywood at one point. Disney films like Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros, which I think were some of the first animated films I saw where I heard Spanish. And you see this again in this period of time where Hollywood is, major producers are drawing upon interest in Brazil since it was the new hot country, the new BRIC nation. But it was also these representations of Brazil from a U.S. perspective. We're also trying to negotiate that tension between the North and the South, the superpower that the United States had been, and this new location.
And you see some of the stereotypes still lingering and reflected, but they're also at pains to try to portray it in a different way too.
And it's interesting. There's a great book by a scholar in Brazil that looks at how Brazil has been a sort of character in hundreds of international films. And often it's a favela as a location in Rio. And there's an anthropologist who's talked about, several have talked about the favela is an interesting site for attention. It has the allure, this tropical allure that's in Brazil, and the lawlessness. And so people are curiously drawn to these spaces. There's a lot of tourism of favelas, visiting favelas.
I'm guilty.
And so you see these films, The Incredible Hulk from 2008, you see Fast Five from 2011, and I don't know which iteration Fast Five is on now, Fast and Furious.
It's at least 10 now,
20 or something. So they are located in Brazil, and they go to the beach, but they also go to the favela. And you see some of the repetition of these tropes where typically the white Anglo women find romance and adventure in Brazil or Latin America, and men in U.S. military style gear and weapons go down and impose justice and order on a presumably lawless land that doesn't need them there. So that was part of the. Is it the films that you see in this period? Those the ones that I talk about.
Yeah.
Is this another good neighbor era?
Yeah.
It's sort of
That's a good
repeating
question.
some of this policy.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, U.S. policy on Latin America can never necessarily be described as consistent always, but we'll catch us up till today, right? This is an interesting period for you to, I guess, look back and reflect on your work, because now Lula's back.
Yeah.
He left in what, 2010, I think, or 11?
Right, 11.
And
was
now,
when-
here we are in 2023. He's been in office again for 10 months after a very tumultuous period where we had the huge Petrobras scandal,
Right.
and his handpicked successor getting ousted, and caretaker government, he goes to jail, et cetera, et cetera. There's just so much that's gone on. What do you see, I guess, reflected in this earlier era, like in his newer stances? Like, or how are you thinking of what you did before and how it's relevant to today, I guess?
I would think, from the perspective of film and media studies, I think that one of the most interesting developments in the past 10, 15 years has been the increased representation of people of African descent, who self-identify as Afro-Brazilian, in screenwriting, producing, directing, on screen. Now, I say that, and this development can be traced back to some of the cultural policies that the Lula administration put into place. Gilberto Gil was the Ministry of Culture.
And tell us about him just a little bit.
A little bit. Well,
he came to Atlanta. That's the only reason I know about him.
He had been a musician, well-regarded musician, and he was appointed to lead the Ministry of Culture in 2003. and
Afro-Brazilian
right,
descent. Yeah.
right, yes.
What style of music would you say?
Oh, his range has varied quite a bit, so I wouldn't want to pigeonhole
Yeah,
him. But
that's good.
yeah, música popular brasileira, or MPB, sort
Yeah.
of just, yeah. But he's been in part of a lot of avant-garde styles of music, tropicalia and so forth. I think a music historian might do a better job.
That's fine. But so he had been part of this effort during the first Lula administration to increase
Right.
representation
And so
among Afro
there were
Brazilians.
policies put in place to grants, opportunities that were created to expand the locations for film and media production outside the Rio and Sao Paulo axis, the concentration of production. And so you see growth and programs and opportunities and centers where you could learn to do the craft of film and media study, development, production. And then you see that door opened and you see more people who self-identify as Black and census data. The majority of the population in Brazil beginning to take advantage of these new opportunities. And that translated into now you see greater diversity on screen. So I think that's one of the most exciting developments from my perspective.
For sure.
But in terms of where is Brazil now and how is it thinking about the BRICS vis-a-vis this time period, it's such a different landscape now. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, we had a diplomat who spoke with us, and he said directly after the storming of the capital in Brasilia from Bolsonaro's supporters, and he said, you're exporting your bad habits to Brazil, talking about the U.S., and it has been interesting to watch how Brazil's kind of taken on that same character. I do think there's a lot of the character of polarization politically. I do think there are a lot of unique aspects of Brazil's political landscape that are very different from the U.S., but it does seem like we're in an area where media is kind of more being weaponized in a more polarized environment. So, but yeah, I mean, give us your sense for. You were recently there 4 or 5 months ago, or
I was
more recent
there
than that?
in July of 2022. It was before the elections in 2022.
Okay. So yeah, what was your kind of feeling on the ground when you were there? Like how did it feel differently, I guess? And these are tricky, right? Feelings and impressions are tricky, but you've worked pretty extensively there in the past.
Yeah, I felt they were still recovering from the pandemic. It seemed that they were walking around. There were, in places where I had been in the past, in Sao Paulo and Rio, there were stores that were shut, closed. And so I think they're still recovering from the pandemic. There was also a quietness on the streets. I had walked around, you can walk everywhere. And it seemed like there weren't as many people on the streets. Now, was that because people were holding up in their own homes? Was it because there was still some concern about COVID, the pandemic? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think one of the ways that Brazil was celebrated in the past, when it was declared a BRIC, was there's a democratic nation. It's very unique. It's distinct. It doesn't have the ethnic strife or the violent aggression with neighbors.
Right.
But I think that there has been a history of polarization and strong differences of opinion that are not new. It just seems to be more marked now.
Yeah.
And a political scientist, I'm sure, could intervene and talk about the increasing political polarization that we see in the United States and across the globe. But
yeah, you kind of wonder, how much of that is a symptom partly of the pandemic and just insularity, right? That people had to turn inward, and there was so much question about which sources to trust and so much clashing over measures aimed at ameliorating the pandemic. Like particularly in Brazil, there was a lot of that.
Well, there had been culturally, there's been great emphasis put on being cordial and courteous in public, and that has broken down.
Yeah.
Temporarily. Well, I don't want to say that it's completely disappeared, but there has been public relations, public interactions have been. There was an expectation of being kind and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think if we bring it to relevance for kind of international affairs, right? Like right now, Brazil is trying to reassert itself, it seems like. It's in similar ways to the U.S. I mean, there are differences, but similar to the post-Trump period of self-imposed isolationism. I think Lula is trying to make the similar case to Biden. Like, we're back on the world stage, and we're no longer taking this insular approach, but the question is what is your role at this point, and it's been interesting to see the embrace of the BRIC Forum in its modern iteration, which is in partnership with Russia and China, which right now are kind of persona non grata in terms of in the mind of the West anyway. And this idea of alternate global governance, I think, is really interesting. And Brazil has been less assertive on that in the past, but I think is maybe seeing that it has to assert itself more.
Yeah.
Particularly with as much as it was criticized over the Amazon and stuff like that in these global forums. So
yeah. Well, even thinking about the BRICS now, it's a different formation. But it's very tricky. I think we were talking earlier about how Brazil has a very delicate balance to try to strike. Its significant, most important trading partner is China for its agribusiness, foreign direct investment from the United States. Its fertilizers for its agribusiness come from Russia. So it's sort of stuck between these really difficult. It wants to, thus far, Lula, has tried to reassert Brazil's role on the international stage. But where can Brazil really lead? Where can it show us all how to do things differently and perhaps better? And I think they have a great deal of leadership in the area of environmental.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, yeah, green energy development.
The things we're all talking about now, particularly like alternative fuels, they've been really strong in for many, many years.
Hydrogen power.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, they have a big petroleum industry too, so we're all learning.
Right.
But in this question of the Amazon, I think they have, they're the kind of keepers of the Amazon, and they're taking that seriously. There was a lot of talk about that during Bolsonaro's administration about how you balance environment and economy. And I think that's kind of where the tension is, kind of where they're starting to assert themselves as a leader. But I guess just what's next for you? You've got lots of duties as department chair. You're not able to work as much on just Brazil as you might want to. No. This is our curse my curse as a journalist. Like, I can get into Brazil for 1 week, and then the next week I'm off to China or financial technology or whatever the next topic is. But how do you see your work evolving, I guess?
Well, I'm working now on Black Cinnamon Brazil. I think that's an important and exciting development in film and media studies. But I'm really interested in seeing Brazil, China, U.S. relations, how that will develop and how it'll be discussed and debated in film and media and television, and what are the directions for that, and how can we think about these current tensions that go beyond a Cold War framework? I feel that there is a tendency to fall back towards that type of a framework, but that's not, I don't think it's a productive way of looking at today. Yeah. Brazil, for example, is considering, the last I remember reading, becoming part of the Belt and road initiative with China. Brilliant, in some ways, a really brilliant foreign policy to will help you build roads and infrastructure so that we can import and export more easily. If Brazil isn't getting international assistance from some other source, then why not?
Yeah.
And China's its key partner.
Yep.
The us versus them dynamic, it just doesn't. It's just
Well, I
too
think that's
complicated
what
now.
these countries are reacting to, right? Like this idea that, we don't have to choose. We're not being this dichotomous choice that's being forced upon us is not something we have to subscribe to. So that's where the BRICS has kind of emerged as this kind of alternative forum. It's of disaffected, countries that don't feel like they should be given the Cold War option.
Right.
And it's so interesting that these are some of these are countries with which the U.S. will say it has a very close partnership, like with India, for instance. And India, is the most has the greatest knowledge of what China's capable of, and being a border country and having recent skirmishes and all that. But yet, economically and on the world stage, wants to be seen as a player in its own right, not just a bit player in the U.S.-China game. So I do think it's fascinating to see where Brazil will go, being a Western Hemisphere democracy. But seeing these forces come to bear.
Yeah.
So,
And what does a multipolar world look like?
Yeah.
I think that was one of the promises of the BRIC back in the early 2000s. That was the push and promise, and the excitement was about the potential of a multipolar world. Well, what does that look like in practice?
Yeah.
And are people okay with that?
One thing that struck us, having gone to Brazil a couple times to do reporting trips, was how utterly unaware or uncaring people were about the U.S. It was like people weren't thinking about the U.S., which was refreshing in a way, because like in our minds, we're the center of the world, and to see Brazilians feel the same way, and rightfully so, with a country of 220 million people, that's the size of a continent. It was kind of interesting just to see how little this framework of like U.S. China, or even just like U.S. focus had taken root, and people were very proud to be Brazilian.
Yeah. Well, Brazil has its own music, and yes, you'll once in a while hear songs from the U.S. or somewhere else, but they have their own music.
Yeah.
It's they have a strong media industry, so and it's a large country.
Yeah.
They're very proud of their back. They should be, obviously. It is, I guess, surprising for some people when you go to Brazil and the U.S. isn't on the front. Yeah, on the front page.
Well, and it shouldn't be surprising because that's the way we are. But like, it's.
But if you're just take music, for example, we turn on the radio. If you're in France or or Spain, you will hear American songs on the radio. You'll hear it. There's a presence more.
Yeah.
But not as much.
Yeah. Do you feel, just in the media landscape, like, do you feel that the government's going to be doing more? Have you seen any indications that the government's really going to focus on this, or have we reached a point where the private sector is just going to kind of take this and it's going to more reflect the zeitgeist versus government policy?
I haven't had a chance to dig into the cultural policy that Lula has introduced since he took office in January. He's had 10 months. So it's hard to say. I do want to back up, though, and say that there is a strong U.S. presence in film. You'll go to the blockbuster idea. You'll go to a movie theater that has 10 screens, and 8 of them will be, a U.S. production,
right,
or a Hollywood production.
Probably made in Atlanta.
Maybe, yeah. So it'll be my time going. It's been 2+ decades going to and from Brazil. It is an incredibly interesting place. It always keeps me asking more questions.
Yeah. Do you see your department and other departments within Georgia State or within the college doing more focus on Brazil? I mean, y'all don't have a Portuguese program as far as I know.
We it's challenging to get students to take Portuguese and study Portuguese. I don't fully understand why. So we have lost that. Hopefully we can bring it back. Because it is a far more widely spoken language than people might realize.
For sure.
The opportunities for exchange between Georgia and Brazil, the United States and Brazil, are there are a number of opportunities.
Yeah.
So, but then, and from the perspective of a Brazilian studies program, we do have offerings, classes that are offered in different departments, and there are those.
On-ramps, right?
Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, we look forward to seeing more of that. And, obviously we got the consulate here. We've got many different Brazilian companies based in Georgia. I think it's 60 plus at least at this point. So I think to your point about Portuguese, I mean, I think Brazil's economic influence in the state is much more wide than people know. And so we'll continue to report on that and hope to see you follow your work.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much.